Welcome to Creative Solutions for a New World Climate and Artists series. I'm Frances Litman, your host. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region and First Nations worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and water provide us to live, work, and play is due to the reciprocal relationships by which Coast Salish and the world's first people have lived and live today. Today's program is most timely, and we have a number of esteemed guests who Jon O'Riordan, our community partner, will introduce. Jon is a former Deputy Minister of the Environment. He brings his years of experience to this series while keeping the legacy of his late wife, Gail O'Riordan, a beloved music teacher and professional cellist, alive. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Frances. Well, we have three wonderful guests today. First is the reintroduction of Mace Rosenstein, who many of you remember gave a wonderful presentation 2 weeks ago on the US electoral system. His background is in media and telecommunications legal advice in terms of the Federal Communications Group. And he has deep experience in looking at the US electoral policies and the role of the Electoral Commission. So he is now in real time trying to figure out what happened yesterday and what might happen over the next couple of months before the inauguration of the new president in 20th of January 2021. Tom Axworthy has a distinguished career in government and academia in philanthropy in Canada. He served as the principal secretary to Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, and he is the Secretary General of the Interaction Council, a think tank of former world leaders who provide advice all across the world on matters of public policy. And finally, there'll be a question by Bob Sandford, who is the Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at United Nations University Institute for Water, Health and Environment. He is co-author of the UN Water in the World We Want, a report on the post-2015 development goals. He's an extremely good supporter of climate and the arts and a wonderful interviewer. So I'm going to hand it over to Bob, who will start the questions of Mace and of Tom Axworthy. Over to you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Jon. And first, allow me to express my gratitude to our two remarkable special guests. You will know Mace Rosenstein, Washington, D.C. lawyer, as you've indicated, if you were on his webinar 2 weeks ago on the Electoral College. Welcome, Mace. And also with us today is Dr. Thomas Axworthy. Well, Jon O'Riordan has given you an idea of this man's experience in Canadian politics. I found out this past week that Dr. Axworthy also taught for nearly 20 years at the Harvard prestigious Kennedy School of Public Policy. And what I'm saying here is that Dr. Axworthy is a renowned expert on both systems, the US and Canadian systems. And 2 weeks ago, they were in our webinar with Mace, participant questions on the impact of the US situation on Canada. And we didn't have time to adequately address this, and I'm sure you will do that for us today. Welcome, Tom. In that spirit, I would like to begin by asking Mace where things stand in the US at the moment, and then I will in turn ask Dr. Axworthy the implications of what's presently happening in Canada. Let's begin then, Mace, please.
Thank you, Bob, and hello, everyone. I'm certainly honored to be in this august company. I feel like a little bit of a piker, but let me see if I can contribute. You'll recall a couple of weeks ago that we didn't make predictions per se, but we did outline a few scenarios where we felt we could find ourselves today. And I think we would all agree this morning, that the outlier scenarios we discussed ended up being exactly that. There was no landslide either for Biden or for Trump, and instead we have a very tight race where the outcome, it appears, will depend almost entirely on mail-in and absentee ballots, and where Trump will attempt to discredit the results he's already begun to do so. Biden currently leads in the national popular vote by about 3 million. That number is expected to increase as mail-in ballots are received. And remember, we did talk about that too, that I think there was no expectation by anybody that President Trump would garner a majority of the popular vote. Some of the analytics sites right now are forecasting that Biden will win the national popular vote by between 8 and 10 points by the time this is over. But they're also pointing out that notwithstanding that margin, Trump still has about a 10 or 11% chance of winning in the Electoral College. At 2:30 this morning, as we discussed, in the absence of a definitive outcome, Trump took the stage of the White House to first declare victory, as we predicted he would. Second, to allege that all mail-in votes are fraudulent and should not be counted. And third, to threaten, although this hasn't materialized yet, to seek a ruling from the Supreme Court ordering that no more votes be counted and the results be frozen in time as of 2:30 this morning. In other words, he is seeking to block the blue shift that we talked about. That's the phenomenon pursuant to which early Trump returns would be overtaken by later Biden returns. And the White House and the Republican Party and their allies are following up on Trump's 2:30 statement by suggesting that if he loses a lead anywhere, that is, in any state in which he may at a moment in time have the lead, but then sees it overtaken by Biden, that it reflects that the entire process is presumptively fraudulent. Of course, that's not the case. It simply reflects the vote counting process. Meanwhile, there have been problems with mail-in ballots. We predicted that also, which are used in this election to a far greater extent than they've ever been used before. One interesting developing story right now concerns the United States Postal Service, which is responsible for delivering those mail-in ballots. You may know that the Postmaster General of the United States, who's been on the job only for a few months, his chief qualifications, perhaps his only ones, are that he's a major Republican Party donor and a Trump booster. And he implemented changes over the summer that have had the effect of significantly slowing down the delivery of mail in the United States, with at least one result being that as of today, 300,000 votes have been lost somewhere in the Postal Service network. A federal judge on Monday ordered the Postal Service to conduct a manual sweep of its processing centers to find these votes, and the Postmaster General defied the order. I believe that a hearing is going on right now before that federal judge in which he is seeking testimony from the Postmaster General. Bob, I could go through particular state scenarios, but I don't know if we want to take the time to do that. Perhaps it's sufficient to say that in each of the swing states, as we discussed last time, that is states where the vote can be very close with significant electoral college implications, Biden seems to be pulling ahead. The blue shift is in effect in several of those states. Trump will be deemed to have won 2 or 3 of them. And then the real fight will begin over what happens in the event that Biden overtakes the current Trump figures in those swing states.
Well, thank you, Mace. That's certainly complicated. Tom, how do you think the outcomes as they presently stand will affect all important U.S.-Canada relations? Because even between now and January 20th, Trump's actions could have huge implications on our relationships between our two countries.
Yes, Bob. Well, I'm delighted to be on the panel, and I tuned in to the webinar that Mace was a guest on previously, and I wish I'd had his excellent slides then when I was teaching my course on American party politics. So I'm delighted to be here. Well, one of the anomalies of the American system, and there are many, as Mace talked about, the Electoral College being the most prominent, but there are many. But one of them is the very long time period between when you win or lose an election and when power is transferred. In the UK, it's within a day or two. In Canada, it's about 10 days, 2 weeks at most. After an election, there is a transfer of power. Well, Donald Trump will remain president to January 20th. So he has, and his the existing or Republican Senate has months to continue a whole variety of actions, which will be controversial. The Senate leader has already said that he's going to continue to sweep up changes in the judiciary and stuff them as fast as he can in the next couple of months, those that they haven't already filled. There have been a host of regulatory policy on health and safety and the environment going back to the Clinton years that have been wiped out, and there could be a lot more of those. So there's a host of issues, but a Donald Trump who loses could be enraged and take a whole series of actions, I don't think aimed at us, but in general in a destructive mode, which would primarily affect his own country, but there could be implications for the world system. And if Donald Trump somehow continues to thread the needle and is reelected, something that we should consider, that he was in many ways an unpredictable leader in the last 4 years, subjected to tantrums and so on. But there were some constraining factors that he knew he had to run for reelection. And that may have been some deterrent to him. Now, 4 years of Donald Trump without that constraint of a next election, he could be an awesome force without any constraints whatsoever. So are there specific issues that came up in the campaign about Canada and so on? No, I don't think so. There were some complaints again about dairy policy in Wisconsin, but I wouldn't see that we would be in anyone's particular crosshairs in that interregnum until the next inaugural.
So do we just wait and be patient? Is that what Canada does?
Well, I think there are two things, 2 points I'd like to make. So the one is a general point, but I think it's very important, and that is when we look at the backbone of the Trump coalition, the men without college degrees, fearful of the future, worried about globalization, worried about angry about their place in life. That has been the marching forces that Trump has so articulated their anger and their sometimes their concerns. And we have to remind ourselves in Canada that if we can avoid it, we should never allow that to happen here. That is, there should be no part of our country or no part of our polity or our economy who feel that they aren't getting a fair shake. You can't always win everything in politics, but everybody should have a fair chance. And that terrible anger, we have to work very hard in the country to make sure that we avoid that by putting in place policies that are fairer. We're in the COVID pandemic that we've been in, we've relied on cashiers and delivery clerks and people who clean grocery houses and a host of workers who get very little thank, frontline health workers, teachers now trying to cope with COVID in the classroom. Well, they are the people who make our society run. Nobody needed a manager of a hedge fund in the last few months. And yet, when you look at the differences in compensation and treatment, so that's what Canada has to do. We have to ensure that we learn from this, never to allow that marching angry brigade, which is the shock troops of the Trump movement. But then secondly, are we quiet and diplomatic as the United States sorts itself out through this? Yeah, absolutely. There is nothing to be gained from us being on the sidelines and we'll have to deal with whoever is president on January 20th. And therefore, we should be absolutely carefully walking on eggshells in terms of the Canadian-American relationship over the next 2.5 months.
Well, thank you for that. That's most interesting. And also you bring up the point that you know, the media is important in this. And Mace, we've been talking for months about the role of the media in framing the performance of the Trump administration and its policies. And since November 16th, the press has been struggling to define its role in the age of Trump. And on one hand, the general press, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Globe and Mail in Canada, seem to have decided that their news pages will report the facts and attempt to adduce the truth of the matters. This is laudable and might be adequate in ordinary times, but these are not ordinary times. And in these times, their purported commitment to neutral facts can actually be seen to be enabling Trump and the Republicans in their lies. And this has become this is because their effort to report both sides. The press promotes a false equivalency. As US Nobel Prize economist Paul Krugman calls it, it's the other handism, the tension between Trump's asserted facts and reality. And in fact, what they're saying is we'll report both sides of every story as if they're equally credible and then allow the reader to make up her own mind. So the question is has the press actually abdicated its role as truth teller in its determination not to be taking sides in the reportage? Is it confused reporting? Is this being confused with partisanship? As Greta Thunberg has famously pointed out, facts are facts, whereas alternate facts are opinions. So I'm going to ask you, this is Tom also, but let me ask you first, please, is it time for the press to lead rather than follow?
Well, it's a controversial subject, and it's controversial among media in the United States, at least, and I think in Canada also. I think you've summarized the problem very well, and Krugman, who publishes, by the way, in the New York Times, relentlessly and frequently castigates his own employer for its failure, not exactly to take sides, but to understand that there may not be multiple sides to particular stories. He focuses on the economy and on climate in particular. And I think a good example was during one of the so-called presidential debates between President Trump and Vice President Biden, when the subject of climate came up. And President Trump's response to a question about his climate plan consisted entirely, and I mean entirely, of complaining that new buildings erected in the United States under any sort of green program wouldn't be able to have windows, number one. And number two, that wind turbines emit poisonous gases, which kill people in their vicinity. And the reason that I bring that up is that the moderator of the debate did not challenge those statements. She simply said, well, thank you, Mr. President. And now let's hear from Vice President Biden. And in my view, and I'm speaking only for myself, I think that is a complete abdication of responsibility. You know, if Trump says the moon is made of green cheese, then appropriate coverage of that statement is not to say, well, let's talk to some people who think, you know, that green cheese is good for you, rather than saying, but of course it's not. So I think the press in the States at least needs to make a decision, particularly if Trump is reelected, whether it is past time to be nominally neutral and in fact to start advocating for facts rather than leaving facts to the market, which is what they've effectively done.
Well, Tom, how well do you think the Canadian media have done and performed during the Trump era? Have our media fallen into any of the traps that Mace argues has affected the judgment and performance of the US media?
Well, from my reading of our media, if they're covering American stories and so on, and when there is references to what Trump has said, our media have been fairly forthright in saying this is not true, or this is disputed, or these are falsehoods. And we've had Canadian reporters, Mr. Dale, for example, has been keeping a running list of Trump fibs. And I think he's up to 20,000 or something. So within the context of the story, they have been saying this is not true, or makes this claim, but the facts are are against that. So I think that Trump has so expanded the boundary, and the truth means so little to him, that even that's quite extraordinary to say this is a false claim, but we have been doing that. And then secondly, you have both reporters, but then you also have commentators in the comment columns. And that's a different thing. I had a column for many years in the Toronto Star. You rely on your columnists to really make the hard case, I think. And you rely on your reporters when there's a clear falsehood to point that out, but not get in a debate with the political figure. Leave that to the political opponents or to your commentator who is hired in order to advocate.
That's interesting, because that takes us to another thing. The commentators take a number of forms, and it would be interesting to see what, say, Trevor Noah or Samantha Bee and the caustic comic pundocracy that Mace talks about will do now. Will they continue to draw audiences by showcasing divisions in their society, or will they point to the way to heal the country and bringing the American world back together again? And it's going to be interesting to see how the path they take in garnering the ratings by showcasing the divisiveness and what that comes to next. So the next question I have relates to that, though. Can we talk for a moment about political norms and conventions as we've seen them practiced in the United States over the last 4 years? And during our previous election webinar, a viewer asked, well, what the Trump years have shown us is how important conventions rather than laws are to holding a democracy together. What seems to have happened is a rejection of conventions by political elites in favor of pursuit of power. Now, what accounts for the fracturing of consensus among political elites about these crucial conventions? And is our viewer onto something? Can we say that fundamentally what keeps a country together isn't necessarily a constitution or laws? As the viewer said, we rely instead on sub-constitutional or extra-constitutional norms about how we should behave as a people and a polity. Don't these norms help ensure or more or less smooth the functioning of democracy more than prescriptive text? Is it fair to say at some point that we need to pay attention to these norms and conventions? And I'll ask you, Mace, first of that, and then Tom, you could comment if you wouldn't mind.
I think it is absolutely important, and I think the question is very insightful. Just to follow on to your thought, is it fair to say at some point we need to think about this and try to find a way to restore sort of normative discourse? I was thinking about this point and wondered whether we could ask that, if something is evil, if an idea is a bad idea, then can't we find some basis to agree that it's evil and a bad idea without regard to whether or not it's, say, constitutional in the United States? And the Constitution is the yardstick that is almost always thrown up as an obstacle to any discussion about sort of morality in public life or morality in policymaking. And what's disturbing me a lot today and kept me up at night is that irrespective of what happens when the votes are tallied, whether Biden wins or whether Trump wins, I fear that we now have two Americas. And this has been an evolving circumstance, I think, for years, but it's been framed, I think, very clearly over the last 4 years, and particularly during this campaign. And one of the legs of the stool of the Republican Party and Trump over the last few years has been to dismantle consensus and to dismantle and really just obliterate norms and conventions. And what we have, again, I think whether Biden wins or not, is this the spectacle of a major world power. And I think we can agree that the United States still is one, just blown up from within. Its citizens will no longer trust their institutions or even their democracy. And likewise, I think the world equally will distrust and shun the United States. And I do think that all relates to the role and the importance of these sort of sub or extra legal conventions that we as a society have traditionally adhered to and that the world community adheres to as well.
Well, these are obviously important considerations. Tom, can you tell us about political norms and conventions in Canada? Have they been, you talked earlier about avoiding the rage and the divisiveness in the United States, but have our norms been affected by interaction with the US or by its example? And if not, could you tell us why not?
Well, to agree with Mace, and where there is something which has slid over the border, which is in my years of teaching in the United States, the Republican Party. William Weld was the governor of Massachusetts. Edward Brooke had been a well-known senator from Massachusetts. These were Republicans. You could agree or disagree, but certainly within the Democratic context, entirely normal politicians with a high ethical base, i.e. the Republican Party was no more unethical than the Democratic Party, particularly Southern Democrats who played the political game. And something happened in particular to the modern Republican Party. And I don't know whether it was the Tea Party or Newt Gingrich or what actually happened to a great political party whose legacy is Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower, great figures in American history. What has happened to that organization that it has become so bitterly partisan that winning at all costs, it will shed a whole series of democratic norms? I mean, that's a very interesting question, not to pin all the blame on them, but something has happened deeply disturbing to the Republican Party, which is a major party of the major power in the world. Now, has that started to happen in Canada? Yes, not to the same degree, but I see partisanship far more intense in Parliament Hill than in the days when I used to work there. In those days, you would have friends in all parties. You would play baseball against them. MPs from different parties would sit together at their own tables in the parliamentary restaurant. These are all small and tiny things, but every party had some good people, and every party had some people who you would hold your nose about, But today, they dine in their own dining rooms. The staffs go to different pubs. You're on the ice with your elbows up all the time now. And I see the partisanship getting more and more intense in Canada. And I see Parliament becoming, which is the idea of Parliament and the House of Commons is the country as a whole. And that as an institution is getting less and less used. We have issues like omnibus bills, which are a complete travesty of parliamentary, again, convention. You talked about convention, Bob. The kinds of bills you write around issues, you throw everything into a bill, and then you often put time reservations on it. Those are practices which are unparliamentary and wouldn't have been allowed years ago, and they're now going to be routine. So there is something in our party systems everywhere, most intensely now in the United States, where the competitiveness of it gets more important than the end of the game. The end of the game is to have free governing men and women with parties as instruments to express their wishes. People are beginning to forget that that's why we go into politics, for the tremendous satisfaction of winning in power. So we're not immune to this temptation. It's like Star Wars. It's the dark side.
Well, let's talk about.
Bob, could I
certainly go ahead, Mace, please.
Follow up on Tom with a question for him, and it's something you and I have been talking about recently. And Tom, I remember a time too, not unlike the time you described, when when Republicans and Democrats conferred and tried to reach right outcomes, right? Where the sum would be greater than the whole of its parts. And I've always been of the view that that was because there was a concept of public service among the political class, which I think really began to collapse during and after the Reagan years. The idea was that, of course, you want power, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be in the business that you're in. But there was a consensus, there was a convention that that power should be deployed in the service of the public good. And I don't see that now. What I see is power just for the sake of preserving power. And I also wonder whether the fact that money plays such an outsized influence in American politics is a contributing factor there. And I don't know whether the Canadian circumstance is materially different or not.
Well, it certainly is. It certainly is, Mace, for money. We regulate the amount the parties can spend. We regulate donations. We have brought in election financing legislation, 1973, 74. It's been amended many times since. So one would say no money financing system is perfect, but ours is constantly being worked on to try to make it fair. So we haven't had that corrosive power of money, which I think is one of the driving forces of distemper in the United States. But just on your point again, anecdotally, Bob, but when I first went to work in Ottawa, I worked for a man, Walter Gordon, who had been a finance minister and president of the Privy Council. And one of my jobs was to go to parliamentary debates and to visit the policy discussions among the Conservatives and the NDP, not to do opposition research to get points to attack them with. My mission was his goal to me was that there are good ideas everywhere. Make sure you hear what they're talking about so we can learn from them. Now, that's a very different point of view than let's get something so we can put it into an attack ad, next Thursday. And parties have begun to lose what they should be about, which is the promotion of their ideas and persuading people to adhere to them for the public good as they define it. Instead, competitiveness has become all. We've done our best in Canada to have independent election commissions, to have financing of the money, the Election Expenses Act, to try to equalize that. But I see today that virus thriving a little more in Canada than in the days when I went to Ottawa. Admittedly, I used to have hair in those days. It was in the 60s.
Well, let's talk now about one of the most divisiveness of all issues, because we want to get to questions and answers too. In internally divided countries like the United States, taking charge of the climate threat means addressing a lot of the things that you've talked about. It means also strengthening social solidarity, job creation, and eliminating tax avoidance by the rich. In a sense, it requires saving capitalism from itself. And my point is that it should be noted that today, November 4th, is the day that the US officially withdraws from the Paris Climate Accord. And I should point out that provisions of the accord also permit nations 2 months grace in which they can rescind their withdrawal. My question is that how easy is it going to be for the United States to address the climate issue, Mace? And then I'm going to ask Tom how it can be done in Canada. And I'm going to ask him, as Secretary General of the Interaction Council, how former world leaders can help. And we haven't got a great deal of time for this, so please go ahead, Mace.
Well, whether or not the United States can exercise its right within the 2-month grace period to rejoin the accord is a question that I think it's impossible to answer right now, because Trump, as Tom pointed out earlier, Trump remains in office, whatever happens, until January 20th. And the clock would run out on that grace period while he was in office. And indeed, we've talked about the extent to which he could sabotage much of the US apparatus of government and further sabotage its relations with other nations in the interregnum, right, between November 4th or 5th or 6th, whenever we have a tally, and January 20th. I have no doubt that Biden, if he takes office on the 20th, would wish as quickly as possible to restore the United States to that framework. I don't frankly know, and would have to check to see legally, maybe Tom knows, legally, what would be required in order for him to do so, and whether it would have to go back into the United States Senate to be re-ratified. I just don't know the answer to that question.
What do you think in Canada? How able are we going to be able to do this? And can world leaders help us with this?
Well, one of the essential issues is that there are global problems that can only be solved by international cooperation. No country on its own is going to solve climate change. No country on its own can solve the nuclear peril in terms of nuclear weapons hanging over us, or on the pandemic. So we're in the 21st century, we need international cooperation more than ever before, and we're having less of it than ever before. And there's a whole, and it's not just the United States, it's Brexit, it's China being very aggressive in the South China Sea and other places. When the world is going to have to pull together more than ever on pandemics and climate change, that large consensus between internationalism and making our international institutions work, very few of them now are doing so. And so there's a tremendous job for refurbishing the international architecture around international cooperation. Can former world leaders have a role? Yes, a modest one. They can talk about ideas. They can meet themselves with their colleagues from around the globe, get some consensus among their group, and then see if they can impress upon those men and women who hold power that it's possible to do so. But make no mistake, we need enlightened internationalism more than ever, I think, in the history of the planet. And we have less goodwill around that front, with some real players like Russia and others doing their best to thwart that will. And it's a huge, huge job for a proactive, creative foreign policy. Perhaps Canada could play a small role in that.
Okay, I have 1 minute each for you to tell me the answer to this. Looking back 75 years, we're reminded in the midst of a period of horror then that the visionaries of the day were able to look at a world reduced to rubble and see in it a transformation moment for all. If they did that, Mace, might we find a transformational moment in the issues that we face right now? You have 1 minute.
Thanks. I was distracted for a moment because I wanted just to let everyone know that Wisconsin has just been called for Joe Biden. So he picks up 10 electoral votes there.
Hallelujah.
That, of course, was a state that Trump flipped in 2016. So it's flipped back. To your question, Bob, I think what's required, and this is conceptual only, is in the states, is some sort of a truth and reconciliation endeavor. And I say that because I don't think we should or even can forgive Trump and his enablers for what they've done over the last 4 years. And I think that we as a community of citizens should do whatever we can to punish them. And I don't mean to take legal action against them. That's another webinar. But I mean to vote them out of office, to hold them accountable through the electoral process, and to ensure that they're no longer continued to wreak the havoc that they have for 4 years. But reconciliation, I think, has to occur between and among citizens, right? That we have to find a way, even if we refuse to forgive Trump, we have to find a way to engage with our fellow citizens and to listen to their needs and concerns and to understand better why Trump was able to do what he has done for the last several years. Do I think that's possible? I really don't know. And today I doubt it, because I think we really are two nations now. But I think it's imperative to at least make the effort.
Tom, in 1 minute.
Transformational moments. Well, if on the PN that I just talked about in my previous answer on the need for international cooperation and understanding that we have responsibilities to our fellow citizens, but also to global citizens. We have to work together to try to solve these problems. Can it be a transformational moment? Certainly in the pandemic, I think it can. I mean, it has never been more evident that one needs to work together to prevent these outbreaks from occurring, to work swiftly, to damper them if they do break out, to work together on vaccines. And these are immediate issues. These aren't our citizens worrying about climate change 20 years down the line. They're worrying about it this day and this month for their grandparents and their kids. So if we can move for solidarity, both domestically and internationally, using the pandemic, then we can apply it to the environment, nuclear disarmament, the issues of artificial intelligence and the rest of it that we are facing. Yes, I think it can be. It certainly can be in Canada.
Thank you very much. Mace, I can't thank you enough. Tom, thank you so much. I'd like to pass now to Francis to handle the question and answer period.
That was really wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. What a stimulating and engaging program. Yes, we have quite a number of questions here. This one's from Kathleen. Mace, what do you think if Biden wins? What can he do to represent and influence all Americans? Can faith in public health professionals be restored? Belief in the importance of U.S. rejoining the Paris Climate Accord? How much, if any, of the Trump regime's damage can be repaired?
Well, you're asking me that question on the wrong day, but let me see if I can provide a longer term answer. Biden, I think, has one of the themes that Biden has stressed for the last several weeks or months has been that he would be a president for all people, and that irrespective of whether you voted for him, he would be your president, he would represent your interests. I think that's a nice rhetorical, it's a nice emotional pitch. I don't frankly know how receptive the Republican electorate will be to him. I think perhaps that the way to begin is to focus on, and Tom was alluding to this, I think, to focus on concrete and immediate threats, immediate jeopardies. And what is the looming immediate jeopardy? Of course, it's the pandemic. And he does have, I think, a principled programmatic approach to dealing with the pandemic. He would certainly immediately remove the taint from Dr. Fauci and install him in the leadership position and stand behind him rather than in front of him in allowing him to get out front and lead. And I think to the question that it's steps like that, and particularly if they show results in local communities, it's steps like that that I think can get people to be less defensive and less angry and realize that there is some sort of common endeavor here that they have to participate in and allow Biden to lead.
This comment from Jim Bronson and Sandy Goldie, our Project Drawdown, BC Drawdown partners. Yes, truth and reconciliation among citizens. I'm thinking about dinners with conversations between Republicans and Democrats. I want to initiate them online. Way to go. I think you could do it. Now, this one's from Chris. Joe Biden was reproached for depriving people of jobs by his position on fracking, suggesting he would lose the Latino vote. Is it possible to win a US election if you have an environmental commitment?
Tom, do you want to take a crack at it, or shall I?
Oh, go ahead, Mace. It's your country.
Yeah, for better or for worse. Well, I think the short answer has to be yes, it is possible. Look, I wish Biden had been more effective in addressing climate, because in fact, he has a highly detailed and I think pretty impressive programmatic platform on climate. And I think, frankly, the progressive wing of the party brought him along pretty significantly with respect to that platform. I wish that, I wish that he'd said what I would have said if I'd been running for president regarding fracking and actually regarding fossil dependence generally, carbon dependence generally. And it would be to say, look, we have no choice. This is where we have to go. Are we going to stop fracking tomorrow? No. Are we going to stop extracting oil tomorrow? Of course not. But in 20 years we will, or 30, or whatever it takes. And here's how I'm going to get us from this point to that point. And actually, that's what his climate and green policy does. I don't think he was as effective as he could have been in helping people understand that. And look, it could be that we'll know within the next 48 or 72 hours that he was elected, and therefore he was able to overcome that animosity.
Mm-hmm. Kathy Code, who's also our partner in this series, asks or says, regardless of the presidential outcome, do you think America has lost its moral authority on an international basis, considering the number of people who voted for Trump?
Well, there has been no question that the Trump leadership of the United States has had a tremendous impact on the reputation of the United States internationally, both with citizens and with leaders. Recent research from the Pew Foundation showed that support for President Obama and closeness of relations with Canada have fallen something like 40 or 45% during the Trump years. And that's reflected around the world, in Germany and France and virtually everywhere. But the United States also, though, has a residual standing. It goes back to the Declaration of Independence. It goes back to Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. That at its best, the United States has articulated ideals and then implemented them through mass democracy, through the Peace Corps, which have inspired the world. So there's a huge amount of goodwill that the United States has accumulated through the ages, and that can be drawn upon. But it can also be tremendously dissipated. It was in Vietnam, it was in Iraq, and it certainly has been in the Trump years. So people will look at the United States now and not just wait for Americans to take action. They'll start to do it themselves and hope the United States joins. And that's probably healthy for both sides.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, as Strachan says, as a former educator, I keep wondering how much the American education system can be held responsible for the current divisive tone in the US. Could someone please comment on that?
Oh, I will. And we touched on this a little bit a couple of weeks ago. I think it will probably not surprise you to hear that Americans, I think, are very, very ill-informed about the workings of their own political systems, and in particular, their electoral systems. I think, and I'm remembering, again, anecdotally, I'm thinking of my own civics education as a student in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And I suspect the curriculum hasn't changed materially since then. But what we were taught was American exceptionalism and expansionism, and generally a laudatory view of our own systems without really explaining them, without understanding their history. I think if Americans were to understand better how the Electoral College came about, why it is that every state has 2 senators irrespective of its population, why it is that the number of seats in the House of Representatives is capped at 435, which is precisely in order to dilute the per capita power of high population states and states with large urban centers, that it might change consciousness. Do I think that's ever going to happen? Probably not. And certainly not over the next 4 years if we have another Trump administration. Also, it's worth noting that American education is not top down. And local educational authorities at both the state and the community level have vast discretion and authority. The federal government does not set curriculum policy or micromanage educational policy.
We also have just a quick note that the same issue in Canada in terms of reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. When we look at education, how many, in the time when I was in school, there was no teaching about the contributions of First Nations to Canada's history, and everything was on Champlain and the explorers as if no one was here, let alone the horrors of residential schools. So Canada also has, in one critical part of our future, to have reconciliation with our Indigenous fellow citizens. And that will only start if, in our education system, if we understand what a critical part they played in the foundation of the country and their spiritual and ethical traditions. So we have as large a job to do in education on civics to include in the Indigenous as America does to get over its divisions.
Well said. And Pat Carl asks, can divisive politics and the actions of political parties to grab power instead of finding solutions for citizens be avoided by initiating moves away from first past the post and towards a more collaborative government framework in the US, i.e. the two-party system, in Canada, essentially a two-party system?
I think in the States, at least, that the two-party system, look, political parties are crucial. We talked about this, and I think Canadians and any participants in a parliamentary system would agree that opposition parties are absolutely essential. In the United States, unlike in Canada, we have been unsuccessful really in facilitating, encouraging, bringing about the growth of meaningful additional parties. I think the system would benefit if we were able to do so. I don't see it happening anytime soon.
Dale says, winning looks like the new game, and partisan politics is attracting individuals focused on power and winning the most votes. How do we attract folks who are concerned about the public good to political office?
Well, yeah, I'll try and take that one. I mean, that gets more and more difficult to do. Our audience should understand what a difficult life it is being a man or woman who goes into public life. It's not only that the hours are incredible, you are almost on the job now 24/7. I mean, if you go into a McDonald's and you don't drop your plate into the garbage can, someone takes a photo and you're ridiculed on social media. You're not only investigated, your finances, your brothers are, your second cousin. That is, to have men and women go into public life, they have to give up an enormous amount. Now they gain an enormous amount because they have a chance to influence the destinies of thousands of people. But it is a very rare calling for people who want to subject themselves to that stress. Now, can we have that element of public interest that I and Mace have talked about? Yes, we can. And part of it, again, we talk about education in our school systems. We need educations in our parties with staffs, with MPs, and with others on ethics, on public interest. In my Kennedy school years, we used to run orientation courses for the staff of senators and people in the working for members of the House of Representatives. And there would be a whole series of public policy issues, but also value discussions and ethical discussions. An orientation course to public interest, conflict of interest, and ethics and policymaking. Now, in Canada, we don't have that. We don't have that kind of institution. And our parties spend their money, some of which we give them through the tax credit system, on deep analytics and polling. We haven't created party thinking foundations as they have in Europe. Everything goes to win elections. Nothing goes toward thinking about what you should do once you win the election. So there are some major institutional things we can do to promote the public interest and downplay the competitive natural instinct in our party system in Canada too.
Well said, and I believe ambassadorship is a big word that seems to be missing. David Spence asks, what is the role of the Commonwealth in building a wider umbrella of international relationships?
The Commonwealth. Well, yes, Canada is a member both of the Commonwealth and the La Francophonie, which is these are very interesting and useful international organizations. Now they are the inheritors of empire, the French and the British Empire, but it brings together leaders from all around every part of the world with very good discussions and lots of intensive action. The Commonwealth played quite a big role in putting international pressure on South Africa around apartheid. And these are two very useful institutions where our leaders hear the viewpoints of other leaders not in a formal way of a whole series of speeches, but a lot of informal contact. It's a mutual learning experience, and we need that.
Ray Card jumped in and said, I'm hoping at any second someone will burst through the doors behind Mace and announce that Biden has won the Electoral College votes. Yes. This is a question for Mace, but I think it applies to Canada too. This is from Tina Lou. It seems that the Democrats have a class problem. There is a 30-point gap between Republicans and Democrats in terms of support from non-college educated people. Mm-hmm. This has been made worse by the deindustrialization. Democrats appear elitist and out of touch. I write as a coastal elite, she says. Similar trends can be seen in Canada. How do you reconcile these class differences, and what implication does this have for supporting climate change initiatives?
Well, that's. I realize we're nearly out of time. I would start simply, and I think it'd be all that I'll have time for, to note that the phenomenon that Tina is describing represents a real shift, a tectonic shift in American politics that occurred, again, I dated back to around the Reagan years. The Democratic Party was historically, since Franklin Roosevelt, the party of the working class and of unions and trade, the trade union movement. The Republicans were able to co-opt that support starting in the 80s by pitching culture issues and morals issues rather than economic ones. And they have succeeded brilliantly, in my view, in getting people to vote against their own economic self-interest on the basis of cultural and emotional triggers.
Okay, last question here. This one, Mace, can you suggest any ways besides protests and or litigation that we in the US can challenge the laws and norms and conventions that are lacking in moral foundation?
I think I would start with voting. And I know that seems a glib response, right? And one sits thinking, well, but what else can I do? How do I even know if my vote has been counted? And I've been struggling with that this week as an American voter and not knowing the fate of my mail-in ballot from Canada. But I think it's, and this goes to something Tom was saying, to identify people who do appear to have answered a calling to service and to community, and to get them in office. Look, it's incremental. There are no huge incremental leaps possible here. They're going to be baby steps. And I think we have to start taking them, and voting is an easy one when you think about it.
Thank you so much to our audience. Thank you, Mace. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Bob. John, please tell us what we have planned for the week of November 18th.
We're going to be talking about changes in the Columbia River Treaty. The Columbia River rises in Canada, but it discharges to the Pacific in the states near Portland, Oregon. And it was subject to a major treaty in 1964, creating 3 dams in Canada and causing a lot of environmental damage. As a result of renegotiation of the treaty, because it has to be renegotiated by 2024, Canada is looking at ways to restore ecosystem values in Canada to offset some of that damage that was done in the last 50 years. And they're engaging with First Nations through our commitment to reconciliation. So there'll be a presentation both by the Chief Negotiator for Canada and the Chief Negotiator for the First Nations on that webinar. But coupled with this will be another presentation by a local community group that's looking at ecosystem monitoring in the Columbia Basin and how we can track the health of the lakes and the rivers in the basin so that they continue to be in good state. and they will be explaining how they do the monitoring, how they have an open source module for allowing that information to be shared with everybody, and how by the renegotiation of the treaty and that monitoring, we can have a Columbia Basin in Canada that's fit for purpose for a carbon neutral Canada.
It's going to be a fabulous program. Please tune in on November 18th. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you to all our speakers. Bye for now.